Hi, welcome back to another episode of Coldstream Rod Shop. I'm Derek Fraser. We're going to continue working on the 40 Plymouth Chassis. This will be part 2 of the Mustang II Front end. In the last episode, I installed the subframe, put the upper lower control arms on, and put the spindles on, basically making sure everything was in place and where I wanted it to be. Since then, what I've done, I've took upper and lower control arms off, spindles off, and then I finished welding the cross member to the subframe and anywhere else where I had tacked everything on. So right now what I'm doing is actually installing the coil springs, which is, to say the least, a challenge. I Googled a lot of it and to see how other people were installing the coil springs in Mustang II front ends, and there really wasn't a whole lot of positive ways to do it. A lot of people were using like these type of spring compressors here, compressing the spring and jamming it up inside. The one that I ultimately chose to use was you'll see this great big long 5/8 threaded rod here. It goes down through the shock tower. It went down through the lower control arm, and I've got this big piece of I think it's 1 by 2 inch rectangular tubing with a hole drilled into it, so it goes through it. So what I did, I detached the lower control arm completely, had it sitting on the ground, and then I put the coil spring in. The coil spring actually has to be oriented so the bottom of the spring here hooks into a certain point. So that's why I chose this method of putting the coil springs in. And it actually has worked quite safely because the spring itself is retained by a little cup at the bottom, and there's a cup in the top, and the thread goes down the center. So it's just a matter of put a little oil in this bolt and cranking it and bringing it up. Once the lower control arm came up with the spring, I was able to put the lower bolt here through the lower control arm. Now taking it apart, when we go to paint it, I'm not sure if we'll be able to use this technique. We may have to use like spring retainers or something to get it out, but definitely going back again, putting it back together again from scratch. Kind of really like this one. I think there are other spring compressors on the market, but from what I read, like I said, the Mustang II guys, when they're putting these together, a lot of them favored this technique. At least it seemed to be the safest one. Everybody was talking about how springs would come out. So this one's done. I'm going to do the other one. What I'll have to do is, now that I've got the spring in and the bolt on, I'll loosen this off, and then I'll put the spindle in as well, and then that side will be done. So I'm going to do that to both sides. I'll put the rotors, the calipers on. I'll put the rack on the front, the tie rod ends on, everything. And either I'm going to get a set of wheels separately for this one, or I'll bore them off of our Roadster over there just to kind of fit it in and set it back down on the wheels. So I'll try and do some time lapse along the way of the assembly work on this, but that's what we're doing next. Here we are about a day or so later. I've assembled all of the parts in the front end. I didn't do a time lapse because I thought it was just relatively straightforward stuff of putting, rotors on, packing the bearings, putting the calipers on and everything else. But the purpose here is basically to put everything together and make sure it fits, make sure that I can adjust the toe in. So right now I put 2 rods on to the rotors here right now just to make sure that I can adjust the toe in. So I got about an 1/8 inch toe in. I have everything adjusted so that the rotors are perpendicular right now. The rack and pinion steering is all hooked up, and I made sure that if I turn this, it's a little stiff right now because everything is together. There's no load on it. But if I turn the rack and pinion, I can turn all the way one side, all the way to the other. The other thing that I didn't do was I didn't put any of the locking bolts on. I just basically put a regular nut on everything, and I didn't put any cotter pins here on the tie rod ends, because ultimately what's going to happen is that this is all going to come apart again, get painted, and get put back together again. So all we want to do is do like a serious mock-up on this so that the front end is all put together, everything will adjust, everything will turn the way it's supposed to, and then I'll go on to doing the rear end. So I've ordered coilover shocks, and I've ordered a triangulated 4-link for the rear end. I don't know if it'll be in time for this video, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start working on the rear end over there. I'm going to take the rear cover off of it and make sure the gears are good inside, because it's a used rear end. I want to make sure everything looks okay and there's no chunks of metal in the bottom or anything like that. If that checks out okay, what I'll do is I'll cut all the brackets off and basically prep it for when the triangulated 4-links and the coilover shocks come in. So I'm going to keep going with the rear end here as far as I can go with this video and see where we end up. Here we are the next day. We're reaching the end of what I can cover for this video, so I've come as far as I can without parts. Some of the parts showed up last night, which doesn't help me today. So what I carried on with on the 8.8 rear end, and I should tell you that the original rear end that was over there that was out of a Ranger was 58.5 inches from flange to flange. It was actually too narrow for the 40 Plymouth. So when I went out, I took it back and asked them to source me a rear end out of a Crown Vic. The Crown Vics are slightly wider. I think normally they're 62.5, but for whatever reason this one is 64, which fits perfectly for the 40 Plymouth. When I put the tires onto it, I've got about 2 inches clearance between the frame and the tires, so that's as good as it can get. So what I've done, I took the rear cover off, I drained all the fluid out, I basically checked it over for any chunks or whatever in the bottom of it. There was nothing, everything seemed relatively tight. It did come with a warranty from the junkyard that it was a quote-unquote good rear end, supposed to only have a little over 100,000 kilometers onto it is what they told me. So it's a good starting point. So once that's all checked out, I just checked a few other things onto it, made sure nothing else was broke or whatever. And then I started the process of actually removing all of the metal attachments for the leaf springs, or actually for coil springs. There's a sway bar and shock mounts and bumpers. So there's a pile of pieces right there that I've cut off this one side. That took the better part, I guess, of an hour and a half just to cut it and grind it off. Because when you're grinding it off, these tubes are a little bit on the thin side compared to working like with a 9-inch F-150 rear end that I'm used to working with. You don't want to overheat it. Because if you start overheating it, you could potentially start looking into some distortion on the tubes. Never seen it, but it's just precautionary thing. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take another hour and a half or so and take all these other pieces off this side and get the rear end prepped to go into the frame. So what came in yesterday is the rear 4-link kit from Welder Series on the floor. I've used that on the 32 Fords. Great kit. It's quite adjustable, and the triangulated 4-link I find is best for holding the rear end and with coilovers. just, I kind of like the ride. A lot of other people that run the big Chevys and stuff like this, they convert from leaf springs over to that. The other thing I did, I went out and I sourced a rectangular to square tubing to make the rear cross member. In this case here, it's 1.5 by 3 inch. It's 1/8 wall. So what ultimately this will do is we're going to go into the frame. Once I just figure out where the coilover shocks that still aren't here yet are going to go, I'll basically drill and put bushings into that. So the rest of this will be on the next, hopefully we'll have everything in for next week's episode, and I'll actually be able to assemble the 4 links, put the coil on, and install the rear end. But that's it for this week's video. Please like, share, tag, and subscribe. Please send me your comments if you've worked on a 40 Plymouth before or something like it. Tell me what you think, if I'm doing things right or wrong. Be glad to hear from you. Everybody have a great week. Take care.